What happens when Hollywood's most beloved action hero comes face-to-face with late-night television's most controversial host? You won't believe what unfolds when Arnold Schwarzenegger sits down for what was supposed to be a light-hearted promotional interview, only to find himself trapped in a verbal battlefield that would leave audiences gasping and social media exploding. This isn't just another celebrity spat. This is the moment that changed everything we thought we knew about late-night television. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below because you're not going to believe what unfolds when two titans of entertainment collide in the most explosive confrontation late-night TV has ever witnessed. The stage was set for what producers believed would be a routine promotional appearance. Arnold had arrived at the studio in his typical fashion, confident, charismatic, and ready to charm the audience with stories about his latest projects. The green room atmosphere was light, with production assistants buzzing around making final preparations. Arnold's publicist had briefed him on the usual talking points: the new Netflix series, his environmental initiatives, maybe a few laughs about his bodybuilding days. Nobody could have predicted that within 30 minutes, this would become the most talked-about interview disaster in television history. Kimmel entered the studio with his characteristic swagger, but those who knew him well could sense something different tonight. His usual pre-show banter with the crew was shorter, more clipped. He'd been dealing with mounting criticism about his interviewing style, with several industry insiders questioning whether his increasingly aggressive approach was crossing professional boundaries. The pressure was getting to him, and Arnold's appearance, a major booking that could boost his flagging ratings, felt like the perfect opportunity to prove his critics wrong. As the cameras rolled and the familiar theme music played, Kimmel's opening monologue carried an edge that made seasoned crew members exchange concerned glances. His jokes about politicians felt more pointed, his commentary more bitter. When he finally introduced Arnold, the applause was thunderous, but the host's smile seemed forced, almost predatory. Arnold strode onto the stage with the confidence of someone who'd conquered bodybuilding, Hollywood, and politics. The initial exchange was standard fare: pleasantries about Arnold's latest projects, some light ribbing about his accent, the kind of material that usually played well with late-night audiences. But those paying close attention could see Kimmel's questions becoming increasingly loaded, each one designed to back Arnold into a corner rather than showcase his personality. "So, Arnold," Kimmel began, his tone deceptively casual, "you've been pretty vocal about climate change lately. Interesting stance for someone who used to drive around in a literal tank." The audience chuckled, but Arnold's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. This wasn't the direction his publicist had outlined. "Well, Jimmy, people can evolve their thinking," Arnold replied diplomatically. "I learned that protecting our environment is more important than looking tough on the road." His response was measured, presidential even, but Kimmel wasn't satisfied with the easy deflection. "Right, but isn't it convenient how you discovered environmentalism right around the time you needed to rehabilitate your image after that whole California budget crisis?" Kimmel pressed, his voice carrying a mocking undertone that made the studio audience shift uncomfortably. "I mean, some might say it's just another role you're playing." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Arnold's jaw tightened, and for a moment, the legendary self-control that had served him through decades of public life wavered. "I think you're confusing me with someone else, Jimmy. My environmental work isn't a performance. It's about leaving a better world for our children." But Kimmel sensed blood in the water and pressed forward with the relentless instinct of a predator. "Speaking of children, how do you balance being a family man with, well, your complicated history? I mean, it must be challenging to preach about responsibility when your own track record is so colorful." The reference to Arnold's personal scandals hung in the air like a toxic cloud. This wasn't typical late-night television banter. It was a calculated attack designed to humiliate rather than entertain. Arnold's publicist shifted nervously in the wings, knowing that any attempt to intervene now would only make things worse. Arnold's response was controlled but carried an unmistakable warning. "Jimmy, I came here to talk about my work, not to be psychoanalyzed by someone who makes a living mocking others." His Austrian accent, usually charming, now carried an edge of barely contained anger. The audience, sensing the escalating tension, fell silent. Even Kimmel's usual supporters in the crowd seemed uncertain about where this was heading. The host, however, interpreted the silence as encouragement and doubled down on his aggressive approach. "Oh, I'm not mocking anyone," Kimmel replied with false innocence. "I'm just asking the questions that people are thinking. Isn't that what journalism is about? Or should I just throw you softball questions like everyone else does?" The word journalism seemed to particularly irk Arnold, who had spent years dealing with actual journalists who approached their craft with professionalism and integrity. "This isn't journalism, Jimmy. This is something else entirely." The confrontation was reaching a boiling point, with both men's true personalities beginning to emerge from behind their public personas. Arnold, the seasoned politician and actor, was fighting to maintain his composure, while Kimmel, emboldened by what he perceived as ratings gold, continued his relentless assault. "You know what I think?" Kimmel continued, his voice rising slightly. "I think you're upset because, for once, someone isn't treating you like the untouchable Arnold Schwarzenegger. Maybe you're not used to being challenged by someone who isn't intimidated by your reputation." The studio fell into an uncomfortable silence as the full implications of Kimmel's words sank in. This wasn't just poor interviewing. It was a deliberate attempt to provoke and humiliate a guest who had come in good faith. Arnold's hands, which had been resting casually on the chair arms, slowly clenched into fists. "Intimidated?" Arnold's voice carried a dangerous quiet that made everyone in the studio hold their breath. The man who had faced down fictional villains and real political opponents was about to show why pushing him too far was never a good idea. As the tension reached its crescendo, both men leaned forward in their chairs, the pretense of friendly conversation completely abandoned. The audience could sense they were witnessing something unprecedented, a complete breakdown of the traditional host-guest dynamic that would have consequences far beyond this single interview. What happened next would forever change how people viewed both men, and the footage would become the most replayed clip in late-night television history. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before Arnold spoke, his voice carrying the kind of controlled fury that had made him legendary in both Hollywood and politics. "You want to know what intimidation looks like, Jimmy? It's not what you think it is. Real intimidation doesn't come from cheap shots and playground insults. It comes from someone who's actually accomplished something meaningful with their life." Kimmel's face flushed red, his carefully constructed television persona cracking under the weight of Arnold's words. The host had expected to rattle his guest, but instead found himself being dissected with surgical precision by someone who had mastered the art of psychological warfare decades ago. "Accomplished," Kimmel shot back, his voice rising to a pitch that made the audio engineers wince. "You mean like buying your way into politics with movie money? Or maybe you're talking about those environmental speeches you give while flying around in private jets? Which accomplishment should I be most impressed by?" The audience gasped audibly. Even by late-night television standards, this was crossing lines that shouldn't exist. Several people in the front row began looking around nervously, as if searching for exits. The show's producer, watching from the control room, frantically gestured to his team, but there was no clean way to cut to commercial without making the situation even more obvious. Arnold's response was measured but devastating. "Jimmy, I've dedicated my life to public service, to environmental protection, to entertainment that brings joy to families around the world. What have you contributed? What's your legacy beyond tearing down people who are actually trying to make a difference?" The question hung in the air like a gauntlet thrown down in the middle of a medieval court. Kimmel, who had built his career on quick wit and cutting remarks, found himself momentarily speechless. His mouth opened and closed several times before he managed to respond. My legacy? My legacy is calling out hypocrites like you who think they're above criticism just because they flex their muscles in movies and kiss babies during election season. Kimmel's voice had become shrill, desperate. You want to talk about contribution? I've been entertaining people and asking the tough questions that nobody else will ask. Tough questions? Arnold's laugh was cold and humorless. Is that what you call this amateur hour character assassination? Jimmy, I've been questioned by real journalists, real investigators, people who actually understand the difference between holding someone accountable and just being cruel for entertainment. The distinction hit Kimmel like a physical blow. His face went from red to pale in seconds, and those who knew him well could see the exact moment his confidence shattered. But instead of backing down, he made the fatal decision to escalate even further. Oh, I'm sorry. Was I supposed to softball you like everyone else? Ask about your workout routine and pretend your political career wasn't a joke? Maybe we should. Talk about how you left California in worse shape than you found it, or how your environmental crusade is just guilt over decades of excess. Arnold stood up slowly, his 6'2" frame casting a shadow over the smaller host. The movement was deliberate, controlled, but unmistakably threatening. Careful, Jimmy. You're about to cross a line that even someone with your reputation might not be able to come back from. But Kimmel, perhaps sensing that this train wreck might be the most watched moment of his career, pressed forward with reckless abandon. What line? The line where I point out that the Terminator couldn't even terminate California's budget problems? Or maybe the line where I mention that your biggest political achievement was starring in your own recall election? The studio fell into absolute silence. Even the camera operators, seasoned professionals who had witnessed countless television meltdowns, exchanged shocked glances. This wasn't just unprofessional. It was career suicide being broadcast live to millions of viewers. Arnold's response was quiet, almost conversational, which made it infinitely more menacing. You know what, Jimmy? I've dealt with real opponents, political rivals who disagreed with my policies but respected the office. I've faced down union leaders, environmental activists, budget hawks who challenged me on substance. But you're not an opponent. You're not even a worthy adversary. You're just a sad little man who thinks cruelty is comedy. Kimmel's face went through a series of expressions: shock, anger, and finally, a desperate attempt to regain control. A sad little man? That's rich coming from someone whose only qualification for governor was that he could memorize lines and look good without a shirt. At least I earned my position through talent, not through steroids and special effects. The steroid reference was the final straw. Arnold's entire demeanor shifted, the careful political composure he'd maintained for decades finally cracking. You want to talk about earning positions? Let's talk about it. I came to this country with nothing but determination and a dream. I built myself into the world's greatest bodybuilder through discipline and sacrifice. I conquered Hollywood when everyone said my accent was too thick and my name was too foreign. I served as governor of the world's fifth largest economy and fought for environmental protection when it wasn't popular. His voice grew stronger with each word, filling the studio with the kind of presence that had made him a global icon. And you're a failed comedian who found success by mocking others because you never had the courage to build something meaningful yourself. You hide behind your desk and your audience because you know that in any real arena, business, politics, even entertainment, you'd be exposed as the mediocre talent you really are. Kimmel's face had gone from pale to ashen. The devastating accuracy of Arnold's assessment was written across his features for everyone to see. But instead of conceding or attempting to de-escalate, he made one final catastrophic mistake. At least I don't have to live with the kind of personal scandals that would destroy most people's careers. At least I don't have to constantly rehabilitate my image because I can't keep my personal life together. Maybe if you spent less time flexing for cameras and more time being a decent human being, people might actually respect you for something other than your fictional characters. The reference to Arnold's personal struggles, delivered with maximum malice, was the point of no return. Arnold's hands trembled slightly, not with fear, but with the effort of restraining himself from doing something that would end both their careers in a very different way. "That's enough," Arnold said, his voice carrying the kind of finality that made hardened politicians step back. The studio had become so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning seemed deafening. Even Kimmel seemed to realize he had gone too far, but it was already too late to take back the words that would define this moment forever. The tension in the room was so thick it was almost visible, crackling between the two men like electricity before a lightning strike. What happened next would not only end the interview, but potentially end careers, relationships, and reputations that had been built over decades. Arnold stood motionless for a long moment, his piercing gaze fixed on Kimmel with the intensity of a predator sizing up prey. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute moral authority. "You know what the difference is between us, Jimmy? When I make mistakes, I own them. I apologize. I learn. I grow. But you? You turn other people's struggles into punchlines because you're too cowardly to examine your own failures." Kimmel, perhaps realizing the gravity of what he'd unleashed, attempted a weak recovery. "Look, Arnold, this is just television. It's entertainment. People expect—" "Entertainment?" Arnold's voice cut through the excuse like a blade. "You think destroying someone's dignity is entertainment? You think weaponizing pain for applause is what entertainment should be?" He gestured toward the stunned audience. "Look at their faces. Jimmy, does this look like entertainment to you?" The camera panned across the crowd, capturing expressions of shock, discomfort, and genuine distress. Several audience members were shaking their heads. Others looked away entirely. This wasn't the light-hearted, late-night experience they'd expected when they'd gotten dressed up for a taping. Kimmel's voice became increasingly desperate. "I'm just doing my job, asking the questions that—" "Your job," Arnold's interruption was thunderous. "Your job is to make people laugh, to bring joy into their lives after difficult days. Your job is to celebrate human achievement, not tear it down. Your job is to build up, not destroy." His voice dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more power than his shouts. "But you've forgotten what your job actually is, haven't you?" The host's facade finally crumbled completely. Gone was the confident comedian, replaced by a man who looked genuinely shaken by the mirror being held up to his behavior. Look, maybe I got carried away, but you have to understand the pressure I'm under. The ratings, the competition." "The pressure?" Arnold's laugh was bitter. "You think you understand pressure? I've been governor of 38 million people during economic collapse. I've had to make decisions that affected millions of families, knowing that any wrong choice could devastate lives. I've rebuilt my reputation from the ground up after personal failures that were broadcast globally. That's pressure, Jimmy. What you have is privilege that you've chosen to abuse." The studio had become a courtroom, with Arnold serving as both prosecutor and judge. Every word was delivered with the precision of someone who had spent years in the political arena, where verbal combat was an art form and reputation was everything. Kimmel made one last desperate attempt to regain control. "This is my show, Arnold. My house, my rules. If you don't like the questions, maybe you shouldn't have come here." The arrogance of the statement seemed to surprise even Kimmel himself. Arnold stared at him for a long moment, then slowly began to shake his head. "Your house? Your rules?" He looked around the studio with the expression of someone seeing something truly pathetic. "This isn't a house, Jimmy. It's a trap. A place where you lure people so you can humiliate them for the amusement of strangers." Arnold began removing his microphone with deliberate, measured movements. Each action was performed with the same precision he'd once brought to his political duties, sending a clear message that this interview was over on his terms, not Kimmel's. "You know what the saddest part is?" Arnold continued, his voice now carrying a note of genuine pity. "You actually had talent once. I remember watching you years ago when you were hungry, when you cared about making people laugh instead of making them cringe. You could have built something beautiful with your platform, something that elevated everyone around you." Kimmel's face showed the impact of these words more than any insult had. The recognition that his former self was being mourned by someone he'd tried to destroy cut deeper than any attack on his current behavior. "Instead," Arnold continued, placing the microphone on the desk with finality, "you chose to become a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when someone mistakes cruelty for cleverness and thinks that tearing others down will somehow build them up." The studio fell into complete silence as Arnold straightened his jacket and prepared to leave. But he wasn't finished. Turning back to face Kimmel one final time, he delivered his closing statement with the authority of someone who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain by speaking truth. "I've spent my entire life trying to inspire people to be better versions of themselves. I've made movies that showed heroes overcoming impossible odds. I've promoted fitness and health to help people feel strong and confident. I've fought for environmental protection so future generations can inherit a livable planet. Even my failures, my scandals, my mistakes, I've tried to turn them into lessons about accountability and redemption." His voice grew stronger with each word, filling the studio with the kind of presence that had made him a global icon across multiple fields. "But you take the incredible platform you've been given, the trust that millions of people place in you every night, and you use it to make them complicit in cruelty. You turn your audience into bullies by making them laugh at other people's pain." Kimmel opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He had been completely outclassed, not just in verbal combat, but in basic human decency. Arnold took a step toward the edge of the stage, then paused. "You want to know what real strength looks like, Jimmy? It's not destroying someone when you have the power to do it. It's choosing not to. It's building instead of breaking. It's protecting instead of attacking." He looked directly into the main camera. "And it's knowing when to walk away from people who mistake weakness for entertainment." With that, Arnold Schwarzenegger turned and walked off the stage with the same dignity and purpose that had carried him through bodybuilding competitions, movie sets, and the California State House. His footsteps echoed in the silent studio as he disappeared into the wings, leaving behind a host who looked smaller and more diminished with each passing second. Kimmel sat frozen at his desk, the weight of what had just transpired settling over him like a suffocating blanket. The audience remained silent, unsure whether to applaud, leave, or simply sit in shock at what they'd witnessed. Camera operators continued filming, capturing every moment of the host's humiliation for posterity. The show's producer finally managed to signal for a commercial break, but the damage was already done. In less than an hour, clips of the confrontation would begin circulating online. By morning, it would be the top trending topic across every social media platform. The phrase "Arnold destroys Kimmel" would be searched millions of times, and think pieces about the responsibility of late-night hosts would dominate news cycles for weeks. As the studio lights dimmed and crew members began the awkward process of clearing the set, one thing was absolutely certain. This wasn't just the end of an interview. It was the end of an era. Arnold Schwarzenegger had walked off that stage, but his words would echo far longer than any movie line or political speech he'd ever delivered. He had reminded everyone watching what real strength looked like, and in doing so, had exposed the fundamental weakness of those who mistake cruelty for entertainment. The man who had terminated robots, governed California, and conquered Hollywood had just delivered his most devastating performance yet. And this time, it wasn't acting.